These days, we take it for granted that women can serve in the U.S. military, but in the 1770s, things were very different, especially for the first woman to fight for independence in the Continental Army. She was from Massachusetts, and her name was Deborah Sampson. Her story will be enacted in a performance later this week at the Mass Historical Society by our guest. We'd like to welcome the founder, artistic director, and principal performer in History at Play, Judith Kalaora. Thank you much for being with us, Judith.
Thanks for having me back.
Just go back to the beginning of the story, because you've been doing Deborah Sampson for a while. How did you discover her?
I was actually working as a historical interpreter and a tour guide in Boston, and we were instructed to select a real person who had lived during the colonial era but didn't get a lot of credit in the history books. And I kept looking through the books, and I found Mrs. Adams, famous because she was married to John, although we know there was so much more than that. And Dolly Madison, of course. But now we know that there was a lot more, and I went to my management and I asked them, there's got to be another story to tell here, where a woman did something in her own right, where she broke the norm and she challenged the rules. And they actually suggested that I look into Deborah Sampson, and I said, who's that? And I grew up in Massachusetts. I had no idea that since 1983, she's been the official heroine of our Commonwealth. And when I looked up her story, it was fascination at first sight. And I've been fascinated by her since then.
Of course, these days we think of women as sort of normal in uniform, even in combat. But first of all, when she was serving, maybe the people with her didn't know she was a woman.
Yeah, there are some sort of contradictory anecdotes that we hear where some of the soldiers perhaps had a feeling she couldn't grow whiskers, aka facial hair. They called her by sort of diminutive names because she seemed to be a little bit more effeminate. But she was very tall. She was 5'7", according to most of the records that we have. She had a very broad physique. She had worked on the farm, done manual labor. She had been familiar with marksmanry and target shooting since she was young. So she had the skills of someone who did not have the qualities of a 22-year-old woman. She had the skills of someone who had experience doing much more than that, which would have traditionally been considered male experience. So because of her size, she really was oftentimes let alone by the other soldiers.
Now, what I find interesting here is not only was she a hard worker who probably had some smarts, she was an indentured servant. Now, for people who never heard that term before, what does that mean?
A lot of people think indentured servitude is when you come to America and you buy your freedom, sort of 7 years of indentured service. And that's only one type. So there's other cases where a family is in debt and they would bound out their children. The children that were 5 years old or older were able to be bound out. And essentially anyone that you had debts with, you could send a child over and say, well, they will help to work, and if you provide them a place to live and some food to eat, they will work and do what you need to do. And this is what happens to Deborah. Her father abandons the family when she's 5 years old, and her mother can't afford to tend to all of the children. So she sends out Deborah as well as some of her siblings, and Deborah gets sort of tossed around into this essentially colonial foster care system, where she works for a few months here, she works for several years in Middleborough on the farm of Deacon Jeremiah Thomas, and that's where she learns how to work the farm. She's tending to boys who are her age and younger. They're going to school, they're learning how to read and write and do mathematics, and she's able to watch them do their lessons. So she's actually able to self-teach herself while being a servant.
Now, people join the military because they're patriotic, or they have examples in their family, or maybe they want to go to college and pay for tuition, but why do you think she joined the Army?
An opportunity to live a real life. I think she was aware, because she was surrounded by boys who were given the best education. She had a library at her disposal where she was able to sort of sneak books out and read about the world. She knew that the world was much bigger than the Middleborough community. She knew that the world was much bigger than the American colonies. And she knew that her status as a woman was second class at best. And the only way for her to have a real life, a career, the opportunity to make and maintain her own income, was to be someone that she wasn't. So she had this civil war between herself. She's born a woman, but she wants to have the abilities and the opportunities of a man. And I sort of relate her conflict within herself to the conflict that's going on in the American colonies at that time, where it's very much a civil struggle, right? It's not a revolution until we overthrow Britain. Until then, it's a civil unrest. So people who are feeling that they deserve more, these American colonists, are being forced into sort of this second-class citizenry or the second-class subject status, where they are not allowed to have trial by jury. They're not allowed to self-govern anymore. And she sort of feels the same way, where she's being oppressed or tyrannized into a role that is not what she knows she's capable of.
Now, since you started doing performances about Deborah Sampson, some things have changed. There have been changes in rules about access to the military depending on your gender or even your sexual orientation. And we had Me Too. I mean, has any of that changed your thinking about Deborah in any way?
Every day. Every performance, I am looking at what's going on in the news. I'm looking at some of the essential human rights that I feel are being threatened to be taken away from us. And I am working that into the programs, not in that I'm changing the lines or the dialogue, but I'm changing the intonation. I'm emphasizing certain lines more than others in performances where they do reflect on things that are going on in current governmental issues. So the program has changed a lot over the last 15 years, and it's evolving as our government changes and as our society changes. And there are certain things that come up in the Q&As after our programs. We always do Q&A afterwards, where I am asked to address certain modern day issues. And it is also walking that fine line. As a performer, I want to expose everyone, regardless of what their political thoughts are. I want to expose them to true history in an entertaining and educational fashion. And at the same time, I want to be true to myself. I am very, very obviously, sometimes upset by things that I hear in the news about rights being taken away from women or transgender peoples. And so I think that there are really a lot of lessons to learn that Deborah presents in this story that we can continue to focus on.
This has been a news. We're talking with Judith Kalaora from History at Play. Judith, I don't want you to spoil too much of what happens in this history, but when veterans come out of service, they get the respect of the community, they get benefits. What happened to Deborah Sampson?
Well, she is honorably discharged, and that in itself is a surprise, and really is a testament to the fact that she was a phenomenal soldier. But she does work very, very hard to get payment for her service. So, over 10 years pass before she ever sees a penny or a cent of the money that she was owed as a soldier. She did accept a bounty when she enlisted in the Army, but further on down the line, she realizes that, it's still not enough, and she knows other soldiers who had served the same equivalent time or sometimes less were receiving pensions. Now, you didn't automatically receive a pension as a veteran of the Revolutionary War. You had to prove disability. And so this is much more complicated for someone who is a woman pretending to be a man who was severely injured in the war. And we do, cover those skirmishes and those combat activities that she's in the performance. And now she has to go to the doctors and basically say, this is what I did. These are my wounds. These are my scars. Please, show pity or give us the same treatment you've given the men. And it's really not until Paul Revere actually steps in. He actually writes a letter in support of Deborah to the United States government that she, 20 years after the American Revolution, finally receives the first full military pension any American woman veteran has ever received.
Well, channeling any historic figure can be pretty difficult, even when they have an extensive written record. But with Deborah Sampson, how do you do that, at least as far as you're performing?
I find it's almost it's been easier with Deborah than it has been with some of the other portrayals where I have so much material, like Krista McAuliffe, where I've got videos and radio and firsthand accounts, and I've got to really model everything off of her, like gestures, facial expressions, tone of her voice. With Deborah, there's so much written evidence. We have the muster rolls. We have Paul Revere's letter. We have John Hancock's letter issuing her back payment. We have letters of support that really show where she was every step of the way. She went on a national lecture tour telling her story. We have newspaper clippings. We have the speech that she gave. I have a journal that she wrote. And the freedom that I have with Deborah is that nobody really knows what she sounded like. We know that Paul Revere describes her as being an effeminate woman and very well spoken. Nobody really knows what she looked like. There's a couple, coarse drawings, but besides that, I get to create her, but still know the full timeline of her story. And there's a lot of freedom in that too.
Well, to see the full timeline, you've got this coming up pretty soon, so can we tell people about when and where?
Yes, absolutely. Wednesday, January 15th, the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is on Boylston Street in the Fenway. And there's a 5:30 p.m. reception, and then the performance starts at 6. One thing that I want to point out is that it is free for Boston Public School students to attend, as long as they're accompanied by a guardian. It's also free for Mass Historical Society fellows and members, as well as EBT card holders and Connector Care card holders.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah.
Judith Kalaora from History at Play. Up ahead, high school sports with Pat Flaherty.